Okay, I think we can start. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us again on this Friday afternoon. We have the pleasure again today of listening to my esteemed colleague and friend, Dr. Gerard Verdurn, who is our Operations and Stewardship Manager, for those who don't know him. He's going to talk to us about rodenticide modes of action, toxicology, and risk management. Before I hand over to him, please remember to add your comments or questions in the chat box, and my colleague Hiresh will get to them after the session. And for those who are participating in the CropLife CPD program, the assessment is available on the CPD system in category 1 of the online modules. And from what I've seen from the assessment, we're in for a real treat today. This is going to be very interesting. So without further ado, Doc, thank you so much. Please take it away.
Thank you very much, Alriza. Thank you very much, colleagues, for joining us this afternoon. I cannot see you on the screen, but from far and wide, I hope that members joined us today and even non-members to listen to a bit of the gospel around rodenticides, how they operate, how toxic they are, all the myths and legends about whether they cause secondary poisoning and primary poisoning. And eventually we will come to how to manage the risk around rodenticides because they are of nature quite toxic. So I hope that everybody can hear me. I can't see the screen, so I haven't got any complaints yet. So let us start off with this webinar for this afternoon. And as Alriza said, there is going to be a assessment for those of you that are on the CPD program of CropLife SA. So I would really advise you to listen and keep your ears open, because in last night when I compiled the assessment, I was not in the best of moods. So the assessment is not an easy one. I want to test your knowledge and your skills that you built up during this webinar. So to start off with the first thing, these little critters are very interesting. They are the ones that make women jump onto chairs and kitchen tables and utter all sorts of funny noises. And I always find it very humorous to think that the little house mouse, which is the one there on the right hand side, I can't seem to move my laser pointer, but anyway, the house mouse on the right hand side, that is what most people fear. And I wonder why a 25-gram animal can induce such a massive fear in an animal which weighs anything from 45 up to 100 kilograms. But that's the way life is. People are scared of rats and mice for some dubious reason. And it maybe comes from the fact that they invade our homes, they invade our living spaces, our cars, our farms all over the world. And before I start talking about rodenticides, let us just ponder a bit on the reason why we need rodenticides. Now, if you think about humanity, those of you that watch a bit of YouTube and look at the history of humanity and mankind, and I'm recently looking at the junction between the Homo sapiens and what people believe Homo neanderthal is. We've been around for a couple of 100,000 of years, and up until round about the turn of the previous century, we were very sedentary. And until people started moving around, the world was quite a safe place. But then, as people developed and they started exploring the world, especially if you think about the Arab nations that were some of the first seafarers, and the Phoenicians and the Greeks, and then later on the Hispanic nations started exploring the world. They started going all over the world and started discovering, in inverted commas, the world. Meanwhile, there were people living there long before they discovered them. And unfortunately, the place where many of our rodents come from, and we're talking about invasive species today, are actually the very, very far northern parts of the world, the Scandinavian nations, or some parts of Europe and the little island of Great Britain. And obviously, because of the fact that rodents and the rodents we talk about today are the alien invasives in our country, they are highly commensal with mankind. They're always with us. So they basically jumped onto the ships, had a nice board and lodging on the ships. And wherever people then brought the ships into a natural port or a natural harbor, these animals then left those places and they became residents on a new continent or a new island. And there, according to the literature, there is hardly no island in the world without a brown rat and without a house mouse in the world, and they cause total havoc. So humankind was actually the reason why we saw these animals spreading out of their natural distribution ranges and the areas of occurrence. So if you think about, let's say, 3,000 years ago, before people started becoming really seabound and went from their own countries to other places, the ship rat or the brown rat, also called the Norwegian rat or the sewer rat, that's the one on the far left. That was basically only occurring in the Scandinavian countries. That's what we call the distribution range. But now the area of occurrence is basically globally. In other words, it's all over the world. So that is the one in South Africa, which is our biggest problem. So it is quite a large animal. If you read the literature, they talk about the average size of a male brown rat should be around about 240 grams, maybe 250 grams. But there are some of them in the country that weigh now up to 840 grams. And if I look at the number of calls I get about this, and if I look around when I drive around at night in different parts of the country, I firmly believe we have a pandemic population in South Africa, which is going to cause serious problems for us in the future. The one that people always believed was actually the more common one is the black rat or the roof rat. It's slightly smaller, it's dark in color, it's got a more pointy nose, it's got more pointed ears, but they are very rare in South Africa. You seldom, if ever, see them in Gauteng. I never see them in Port Elizabeth, but you do see them in the Durban area, especially in the port area, where they do occur on a very small scale. But they are probably not even 0.01% of the total rat population in South Africa. And then very interesting, the one that scares the blue daylights out of most women that I know is the little house mouse, Mus musculus. And what I've seen over the last sort of 10 years in particular is that there's an increasing reporting to myself, running a poison center that help people with advice on how to control rodents. So I believe there's an increase in the population around the country, and we can maybe attribute the increase in the population to our unhygienic living conditions in the country, rubble lying all over the place, refuse dumps not being managed properly, and just littering all over the place. And this is what makes life easy and very productive for any invasive rodent like these. I put it into context. In South Africa, we have a very large complement of indigenous rodents. And I don't want to go into them today. We only have one real problem group, that will be the gerbils, that hammer the farmers a bit. But all the other things like the tree rat and the pouch mouse and the striped field mouse and the multi-mammoth mouse, these things are all there, but they never ever become of economic importance or structural importance or even health importance in the country. So they stick to their own natural environment. And that is what happens if you bring a foreign species into the country. They establish themselves, they take over the whole place, and they cause havoc for mankind and also then for the environment. So this is the reason why we need rodenticide to control these invasives, and every South African has a duty to participate in rodent control, because if you read the literature, it will tell you that the brown rat is the most invasive species of all species in the world. It even beats some of the things like the house crow, which is also very invasive, and what we call the common myna or the Indian myna. So it is a real plague, and it causes massive havoc for us. So why we need to look at them is a lot of different reasons. First of all, our food security. In other words, the staple food of the world is at risk because of the fact that we've got so many rats in the world. Now just look at that. A typical brown rat, and I'm talking about the medium brown rat, male, which might weigh up to 240 grams. And remember what I said, we've seen South African male rats of up to 840 grams. Consumes about 30 to maybe 34 grams of food per day. And if you again go into sort of thumbsuck reports and thumbsuck literature, because there's no peer-reviewed literature anywhere in the world to substantiate the number of rats, the Americans talk about the New York City has a minimum of 3 million brown rats in that city. And that translates into a consumption of 90,000 kilograms of food per day. So what I've read up also now is the estimate is currently that the world carries a minimum of 8 billion brown rats. And that translates into 200 million tons of food per year that they consume all over the world, which is food mainly grown for people and for our animals like our livestock and our poultry and our pets. So they actually compete with us for our own food, and that is why there's such a pest and a plague all over the world. So food security is a very important thing. And again, I'm going back into my younger days when I started working in the poison working group and started fighting wildlife poisoning and incorrect use of rodenticides. There was a very strong rumor or indication from colleagues of mine that in Africa, the estimate is that um, 20 million tons of grain is actually consumed in Africa per year. So that is enormous. Whether that's right or wrong, I don't know. But even if it's 2 million tons of grain per year, it takes away a lot of food that could have helped the African people to go forward in life. So it is definitely a big problem in terms of our food security. When it comes to if we have the food, the question is always, is the food safe? Now, you've heard over the radio the last couple of weeks, there's been a lot of reports of food poisoning. I don't want to go into that today because that is not food poisoning, it is poisoned food. But rodents being so commensal with mankind, they're all over the place. If you go into a food store, even some of these very upmarket ones, and I won't mention today, I walk around there and I am horrified to see a rat the size of a little kitten running around that food store that brand themselves as being environmentally friendly, organic, blah, 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 all the soft stuff that you should hear to market yourself properly. So they are all around the place and they are known for urinating everywhere. They are known for depositing feces everywhere. And unfortunately, the rat in particular, and to a small extent, the house mouse, their urine and their feces carry some very bad bacteria and some viruses. Now, the most common bacteria that we know of coming off rat urine in particular is salmonella. It can be salmonella typhimurium, different strains of typhimurium, and that causes gastric problems for yourself. And in many cases, people think they pick up salmonella from bad food, whereas it might, in most cases, be that you buy a can of a typical beverage can of cool drink or a fruit juice or something, and you open that can and you drink it from the can, and you ingest the salmonella because a rat urinated on that a couple of days ago and left the salmonella bacteria there. Some of you might know who are more biologically inclined than me that there's something called leptospirosis, which is also an enormously powerful bacterium, which is very dangerous to people. There's things like tularemia, which is not that well known in the country, and then hantavirus also. And there's something then called LCMV. That's something to do with meningitis. Now, the moment I hear the word meningitis, I just get the shivers because meningitis is a human killer. And I've seen cases in my younger days where people pick up meningitis and it takes them about 24 hours before they pass away. So our food safety is also at risk because of the fact we got rodents all over in food stores, in warehouses, in packing houses and stuff like this. That's why if you go to a proper packing place like our big fruit packers, they've got special companies who come in to do rodent control to prevent the rodents coming into the place and contaminating the work areas and even the fresh produce out there with all the urine and the feces, because it's not only unsightly and it's very pungent in odor, but it also carries potentially very harmful or even lethal virus and bacteria can be transposed onto the food because of the urine and the feces. Then if you live in a normal house, we all know that terrible sound, 2 o'clock in the morning, when you wake up and you hear something funny, you hear that gnawing on your wooden door, or somebody chewing up your wooden boxes, or you hear in the ceiling there's something running up and down. I know when people phone me and they say there's a leguan on the roof, it's not a leguan, it's actually a whole band of brown rats playing soccer on your roof. And what these guys do, they gnaw because they are, remember, they are rodents, and rodents have to gnaw continuously to keep their 2 front incisors sharp and in the right length. Otherwise, they overgrow themselves and it's not healthy for themselves. And in the gnawing process, they destroy your structures. They very, very often gnaw on electrical conduits and sometimes also on water pipes. And Hiresh, who's on the meeting today, had an incident where a rat got into his own car and caused massive damage. Now, I've had calls from people who lost a whole BMW because the rats gnawed on the electrical wires. There was a spark. It ignited the car engine. and that R1 million car was basically gone within half an hour because of a fire. So there's a structural risk also in terms of your living environment, in terms of your working environment, in terms of your vehicles, if they start gnawing on your hard surfaces like the wood and the paper and the hard polymers conduits. For me, the scary thing is, what about the secondary human risk? Now remember, we spoke about the primary human risk is where they deposit their own bacteria from their own feces and their own urine onto our edible commodities. Unfortunately, the rodents all carry rodent fleas. It is particularly important for the brown rat and to a small extent to the house mouse and to a large extent to the black rat. But they carry a rodent flea. Remember, we've got different types of fleas. You get a human flea, there's a rat flea, there's a dog flea, there's a cat flea. They're all very similar, but they're quite species specific. And the rodent flea, this little bugger that carries the bacterium called Yersinia pestis, which is what they call the black plague bacterium. And that can cause 3 types of diseases: bubonic plague, pneumonic plague, and septicemic plague. So bubonic plague is caused when that flea bites a person and you get that bubonic plague bacterium into your blood system. Pneumonic plague is where you inhale that Yersinia pestis into your respiratory tract, and you start pick up a very, very high level of pneumonic fever. And what can happen as a secondary effect after bubonic plague into your body through the bacterium is you can start developing septicemia. Now, the vets on war today or people with more of a medical inclination will know once a patient becomes septicemic, you can definitely die within 4 days if you don't get high levels of antibiotics and you don't get life support. So it can be totally catastrophic for a person if you develop septicemia after you got that bubonic plague organism into your body. And in the 14th century, over 50 million people were killed in Europe within a couple of years because of black plague that broke out there. And if you look at more recent reports in the last 10 years, we've had bubonic plague outbreaks in Mozambique, in Zimbabwe, in Zambia, in Malawi, in Mauritius, in Madagascar, and other parts of the world. And I can tell you now that we've even had cases in South Africa, but it was very, very hush-hush under the carpet because the Department of Health did not want people to go into panic. And my worry is if I look at the number of rodents I see around me and I listen to people like Lee Ashford, who's a real rodent buff, and you see the videos he takes at night in the informal settlements, there is a very good chance that we might get a black plague outbreak in the next couple of years if we don't all take hands and do something about this. So yeah, that is the biggest worry. The food security, yeah, it's always there. The food safety, it's always there. But if we get black plague outbreak, I don't think we're going to stop that. We might lose more people than we lose in a war because of the black plague. But don't forget about the fact we speak about an invasive species. So what about the environment now? Now, on certain of our islands where you get these rare seabirds like the albatrosses, the gannets, the puffins, the shearwaters and those types of things. The house mice on certain islands like Marion and Gough and those cause absolute havoc because they don't only eat the eggs of the seabirds, but when the eggs hatch and the little seabird nestlings are there, they also eat them. And there's currently a program under the way between Environmental Affairs Department and BirdLife SA to gather up money to do a total extermination of the house mice on Marion Island because the seabirds there are at grave risk of being totally wiped out because of house mice. And you can ask yourself again the question, how did they get there? They got there because of people moving around the ships, and they brought along a couple of mice unknowingly, and they invaded the island to the extent that there's definitely a couple of million mice there that cause real problems for the seabirds. And more towards an outside area, in other words, away from the islands into our local South African subcontinent, then the rats in particular can also debark a lot of trees. I know it's an impact on the forestry people that lose a lot of their timber trees of debarking, but don't forget about the fact that they also gnaw on our indigenous trees. And we can have a problem when they start doing that and causing the collapse of the plant ecology, which will then cause the collapse of our whole ecology, because the plant ecology is actually a support for the whole animal kingdom also. So rats are really a problem, and we have to take care of them. The question is, how do we do it? Now, ever since I joined CropLife SA, or became involved in CropLife SA in the old days at CASA, in about 1992, 1993, this idea of IPM, or Integrated Pest Management, was always on the fore. It evolved over years into integrated pest management, integrated rodent management, integrated vector management. When you talk about vectors like the malaria mosquito. But when we talk about this today in terms of rodents, if you look at my slide out there, the main thing is our sanitation in the country is not at a place which is conducive to taking the rodents out of the loop. Look at that picture there. This is typical a picture on a backyard of people, or in a rural area, or at a dump site, or in a industrial site. And I worked here with Quaid when he was still with one of our member companies a couple of years ago. We were trying to find a site to build a new incinerator for the country, and I was horrified to see that there are literally billions and billions of kilograms of solid waste lying all around Kaberga. And it just led me to one thing. There is definitely a massive rodent problem, because we create a fantastic living environment for them. There's hiding place, there's breeding place, there's living place, there's escape place for them. So what more can you want as a rodent? On top of that, our urban people, especially you dog lovers and the cat lovers amongst you, don't limit the food supply for the animals. Now, most people who play coochie coochie with their dogs, make sure the doggy always has something nice to eat, and make sure the food bowl is always full. People that feed birds in the garden, by all means do it, but limit the food supply. And what I tell people that complain about the fact they got rodents, I tell them, if you have dogs and you have cats, or you want to feed the birds, you limit the time when you supply the food. So you don't always leave the food out, because a bowl of dog food like that is like a KFC. They go there because they know there's everyday food there. They don't have to go and forage anywhere else, and they grow fat on that. So you've got to limit the food supply for that, because the moment you give an animal like a rat living space, you give them food, and you give them a dripping tap like you see over there, it is rat haven, and they will breed, because nature dictates the more food, the more water, the more living space, the more you breed to fill up that niche there and to fill up that gap there. So limit the supply of food and water and the living space by making it cleaner, and also managing your animal or your companion animal foods out there. Some of the anti-pesticide people have advised us. I'm chuckling here when I just think about the advice I got at the meeting, which was held at DFFE a couple of years ago, when we spoke about the massive rodent problem in Cape Town. And they said, but we should issue all the people with little snap traps, and they can catch all the rats and the mice out there. I can tell you for a fact that snap traps work. The cage traps work. The snap traps for a mouse are really effective. I had them in my house, a whole family here, and I trapped, I think it was 15 in 2 nights that I trapped, and I wiped them out completely. But if you think of the magnitude of house mice around the country, there is no ways in the world we're going to crash the population or control the population by just deploying snap traps. If you think about the cage traps that work pretty well for the brown rats, you work to a certain extent, but you've got to be very clever, because remember, we work here with animals with a very high intelligence. And if you don't manage the cage trap appropriately, and you don't clean it often enough, they learn soon enough. When you see that wire cage, you walk around, you don't go inside, because my mates were trapped there a month ago, and my mates emitted an alarm pheromone to say, we in trouble here. And my mates also emitted alarm sounds, very high-pitched sounds, that you as a human being can't hear, but they can hear. We said to them, we are in trouble, so don't come into this place. So they form part of an overall IPM or IRM strategy, but they cannot on their own, in terms of mechanical devices, control rodents effectively to bring the population down to an acceptable level. We have natural predators. So Africa is blessed with 12 owl species, of which the spotted eagle owl And the barn owl are the ones that are also living commensally with mankind, in other words, very much close around us. And they do take out large number of rodents. And so we have snakes also. That is Rod's favorite, the snakes. There's a picture of a mole snake, the front end of a mole snake, the business end of a mole snake. And unfortunately, most people don't like snakes. So when they see them, they kill them. So every time you kill a snake, just understand you generate 40 more rodents. So some people always also tell us, but don't put out rodenticides. Leave it to the owls and to the snakes. It is impossible because the abundance of rodents in the world is just of such nature that the owl population in the urban areas cannot take them out. A pair of spotted eagle owls with 2 chicks in the nest will take 4 rats per night. A pair of barn owls with 8 chicks in a nest will take out, maybe if they really go on a hunting frenzy, can take out 64 mice per night. They don't eat them all, but they go on a hunting frenzy. But even that is not sufficient to crash the population. But they do form a very important part of rodent management. So our job is to make sure when we do a baiting campaign, we don't harm the owls and we don't harm the natural predators which live on the ground like the snakes or even other small carnivores. So rodenticides to me are a very important component, even though they are very toxic. But without rodenticides, I do not believe we're going to solve the rodent infestation problems of the world at all. It's impossible. You need the chemical support there to make sure you bring the population down and you manage them appropriately to help the owls then to help you to keep the population at an acceptable level. We also see very often on the internet and Facebook and all these funny things that you people read and also in stores, electronic deterrents. So that you put on your house and they make a signal and they chase the rodents away. The question is, what is the purpose of that? Our purpose is not to chase the invasive species away, but to kill it. And these things do not work in our South African residences because we work with mortar and brick. They work in America. We've got mostly wooden houses full of pipes. And then when you attach it then to your structure, that high level sound or that high frequency sound will go through the pipes and will act as a deterrent to keep the rodents out. But it does not kill them. So it is a very small part of integrated rodent management, but I don't believe they serve any purpose in our country. So I'm a firm believer in sanitation, food and water limitation, mechanical trapping, definitely supporting our natural predators out there, and then integrating into that our range of rodenticides that we have in the country. And believe me, we've got a very good range, as long as you do it appropriately and don't cause a risk for anything and for the people around you. So I'm going to go a bit into the different groups of rodenticides. There's basically 3 or 4 groups of rodenticides based on the chemistry. And if you look at the middle molecule there, that is coumarin or coumarine. Coumarine is a very nice smelling substance. I don't know whether any of you know the Old Spice male deodorants or whatever they call them. That nice smell that you smell in that, and even some of the ones that are used by the ladies contains coumarin. It's got a very pleasant natural smell. And interesting, it comes from the one of the mountain goats that live in the Alps. I think it is the chamois that live in the Alps. So they produce coumarin as a natural chemical. And this is a chemical which is used very widely, not only in the cosmetics industry, but it's a base molecule to build other molecules from. And if you look at all the molecules around the board today or around the screen today, you will see that all of them contain the basic coumarin molecule. And that's why this group of rodenticides is then referred to as the coumaryl derivatives. And the oldest amongst them is warfarin. Now, warfarin has a dual purpose. It is first of all used as a rodenticide. It is very old. There are still some of them in the market, especially in Europe. I don't think we have a registered one in the country at present, but there was one many moons ago. And secondly, it is used in the medical industry or the medical profession as a blood thinning agent for people that have cardiac problems. In other words, to keep your blood flowing and to prevent clotting in the blood. So warfarin is very old. It is a very good substance to use for patients with heart conditions, and it is also still I would say, a fairly good type of rodenticide if you manage it appropriately in an IRM program with other rodenticides and together with your other mechanical and natural methods of control. The second one on the list there is what I call cometetrolol. That was originated by one of our member companies many, many years ago. It's also one of the oldest ones. And when you see a 1 next to it, it means it is a first generation rodenticide. I want you to look at warfarin, and I want you to look at cometetrolol. The molecules are very simple. It contains the basic coumarin structure, and then attached to the coumarin structure, we add on other bits and pieces to the molecule to make it into a rodenticide. Okay, so warfarin and cometetrolol are the first generations, and we talk about this a little bit later. Then we come on to the second generation ones. Now we look at difenacone, that you see our difenacone, again, the base of the coumarin is there. But attached to it is actually 4 benzene or benzenoid types of molecules, all in one little straight line out there. And then another one, which is similar, is bromodiolone. And you can see now where the broma comes from. There's bromine in the molecule at the left and bottom corner of the bromodiolone. And there's brodifacoum. So look at brodifacoum and bromodiolone look very similar, but this bromodiolone has got an extra hydroxyl group in the middle of the molecule, whereas the brodifacoum does not have it. It also has a bromine atom in the molecule. And drop one down further to diphenthioline. Now, diphenthioline, if you switch the molecules a bit around, looks virtually identical to brodifacoum, with the one exception that instead of having an oxygen atom in the coumarin portion of the brodifacoum, which is on the left, if you look at the right-hand side of the diphenthioline, that oxygen in that one ring was replaced by a sulfur atom. And in my days when I did synthesis of human hormones and anti-cancer drugs, we often replaced an oxygen with a sulfur atom, which made it orders of magnitude more biologically active and more selective in the way it worked in the biosystem. So this is what organic chemists like myself do. We replace oxygen with sulfur. We even sometimes replace it with phosphorus because it gives the molecule different attributes. So even though the two molecules look very similar, they act differently in the body, and therefore the toxicology is also different. And then the last one of the group, which is also a second generation anticoagulant rodenticide, is flucomorphen. Now look at the molecule. You can see there is a resemblance with brodifacoum and with diphenthioline, and even to a certain extent with bromodiolone. But at the far right-hand top of the corner of the molecule, you see 3 fluorine atoms linked to a carbon atom. So that's basically a CF3, what we call moiety on the molecule. And I know from my own research that I did when I was an MSc and PhD student, the moment you build a CF3 into a molecule, all hell breaks loose. Fluorine is a very funny element, and I don't know to today why it makes molecules into what I saw with them happening. But I know for a fact the moment you build a trifluoromethyl group into a molecule, it has a narcotic effect apart from the other effects it has on you as a human being or the target organism. So flucomorphen is also the group of one of what we call the really super warfarins. So the toxicologists talk about warfarin as a warfarin, and then talk about cometetrolol as a super warfarin, and the difenacone, bromodiolone, flucomorphen, diphenthioline, and brodifacoum as the really super warfarin because they are very active and they are very potent and they're highly toxic. So don't worry about the molecular structure. I do it for my own because I like to look at little molecules. They're my little babies I played with all my life, as long as you know the names of the active ingredients, because we're going to be talking about them a little bit later on. And this is the main cluster of the largest portion of rodenticide used not only in South Africa, but all over the world. It is used in Europe, it's used in the East, it is used in North and South America, and all over the place. I'll talk later a bit more about the toxicology. Then we also have another group of rodenticide, which is called the indane dione derivatives. And I've drawn the molecule for you there of indane dione. That is also a base molecule, not only of rodenticide, but also a lot of medicinal compounds or pharmaceutical compounds or industrial compounds. If you take that indane dione and you see on the far right hand side, the little junction there, if we open up that ring up there and we attach other parts to the molecule, it can do a lot with this molecule. It becomes a building block for a lot of very useful molecules for mankind. What the chemist did was then they took the basic 1,3-indane dione molecule, added on other moieties to it, like you see in the case of diphacinone and chlorophacinone, and they turned it into rodenticides. And both of these also fall into the group of 1. In other words, they're group 1 anticoagulants. They're not group 2, so they are not the super warfarins. So they're not related to warfarin, but they are called also then first generation anticoagulants. They're not that commonly used in the world anymore. I don't think we've got any diphacinone or chlorophacinone registered in the country, according to what I can see on Agri-Intel and other resources. But they used to be very common in the old days. And the reason why they're not used that widely is because of the fact they are not as active as the typical coumaryl derivatives, even though I think they can play a very important role in ecologically compatible rodent management. So maybe take a hint, those of you that are here today representing companies. There is place in the market for some of these, and I'll explain to you later why I think they can play a role. A fairly new kid on the block in South Africa, for that matter, but been around for donkey's years, is cholecalciferol, also known as vitamin D3. So vitamin D3 is completely different from anything else in terms of the rodenticide market. It is a different mode of action. It's a natural molecule which is synthesized by the body. But if it's used in excessive quantities in the bait, it becomes a rodenticide. And it is actually very, very effective, but it has a couple of attributes that one has to be very careful of. So all of these ones I mentioned now are what we call subacute and chronic. In other words, if you eat them as a rodent, it will have an effect on you, but it won't happen in 1 hour or 3 hours or 4 hours. It will take a day or 2 or 3 or up to 7 before you get the effects, before you die off. But we also have 2 acute toxins that are used as rodenticide in South Africa and other parts of the world that kill with immediate effect. And the most commonly known one is aluminium phosphide, which is also a fumigant for grain fumigation, and then zinc phosphide, which is used as a bait. And I will tell you more about these two, but these 2 chemicals are chemicals that are acutely very toxic and acutely very fast. So if you want to kill a rodent on the dot, that it doesn't even move more than 1 meter away from the point of ingestion, you use aluminium phosphide or you use zinc phosphide. And they are available in the country for rodent control and for gerbil control. And farmers very often use, especially zinc phosphide, for controlling gerbils. Now, I mentioned the word very toxic. It doesn't mean that you've got to run scared of them. I'm not scared of chemicals. I'm scared of people, because people take chemicals and they turn them into little mini warfare machines. If you use zinc phosphide and aluminium phosphide strictly according to label and effectively, they cannot actually cause any environmental damage. But I've seen environmental damage because of misuse. So just take that as a hint for going forward when we start discussing how they operate and how they work. So I'm going to go back to my previous one. So we've got the coumaryl derivatives, of which there are basically 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And we've got the indane diones, only 2 of them, cholecalciferol as a standalone pillar, and then the 2 phosphides, aluminium phosphide and zinc phosphide. And these are the ones that we use in South Africa and, for that matter, all over the world. The question is, how do these things work? So the coumaryl derivatives and the indane dione derivatives, I mentioned to you, are all subacute or chronic toxins. So subacute means it doesn't kill you immediately. It takes a while for the chemical to take effect, and it is mostly a case of takes up to, I would say, minimum of 3 days, mostly 4 days, sometimes 7 days. In the case of house mite, can be anything between 12 to 22 days to kill a mouse off, whereas the rats are more susceptible to these derivatives. So the way in which they act is they are called the vitamin K epoxidase reductase inhibitors. Now that's a long term, and those of you that have biochemistry under the belt will know about all the cycles in the body where you get interaction between molecules, building up molecules, breaking down molecules, enzymatic action and stuff like that. So I don't want to go into too much details because myself, I'm not a biochemist. I'm the one who makes the molecules. So, but what they do is whenever an animal ingests one of these coumarols or indandiones, it blocks the vitamin K dependent steps. Listen to this, the vitamin K dependent steps in the synthesis of very important factors. We call them factors or cofactors. And the factors are prothrombin, proconvertin, and other factors that are called the blood clotting factors. So anybody knows when you cut your finger in the kitchen or you get a bruise when you walk past a brick wall and something happens to you, like you shave yourself and you cut your body, if you're a normal human being, that blood should clot fairly quickly unless you get yourself a deep gash with a kitchen knife. You might have to go to the doctor for a few stitches, but normally with a minor bruise or a minor cut, your body starts kicking in these factors to stop the blood from flowing and to clot the blood. So what happens if you look at the middle picture there is when you got a tissue injury, then the body starts producing prothrombin, and it's a factor 2, and the prothrombin then is broken down by phospholipids into thrombin factor 2A, and that then produces something called fibrinogen. And fibrinogen is a very important protein that is soluble in whole blood. In other words, whole blood, remember, whole blood consists of the red blood cells and then the plasma. But it is soluble in the whole blood. And what happens then, it transforms into fibrin, which is then that clot that forms on top of the wound or in the wound. And that stops the bleeding. And that is very important. Now, when you add a coumaryl derivative or an indandione derivative into the biosystem of an animal, this fibrinogen cannot perform the function of forming the fibrin or the blood clot or that little scab wound or the scab on the wound to stop the bleeding. And that is why we call these substances collectively anticoagulants or blood thinners. Okay? Most people talk about an anticoagulant. Some of the Americans talk about a blood thinner, but that is what people do. And that's why in the beginning of times when they discovered warfarin, it was called the first blood thinner on the market. And later on, they developed the term anticoagulant. So what happens then is the animal eats some of the rodenticide. It starts affecting the vitamin K dependent steps. It then cannot produce the prothrombin, which then affects the chain, and it cannot produce the fibrin, and the animal starts hemorrhaging internally and from the orifices. So the question that people often ask, but isn't this cruel? I am not very much in favor of discussing animal cruelty and animal welfare, even though I'm a nutcase myself for all animals except for rats and mice and pied crows, and sometimes also for dogs. But luckily, in the case of this, there is no pain involved. And that is why these rodenticides work so well as rodenticides, because the animal doesn't have pain. The animal doesn't know that what it eats causes that feeling inside the body of starting to hemorrhage, and they keep on eating until the day they die, unless there's something else we add to that rodenticides, which I will discuss a little bit later. Compared to these things, if you take an acute rodenticide, or let me rather go back one step. If you take an acute toxin, and I'm going to touch here on something which is a real bone in my backside, which is aldicarb, which is sold all over the country by poor people as a rodenticide, why don't we then use an acute substance like aldicarb to kill rodents? It is because of the fact that if you induce that symptoms of poisoning in the rodent with an acute toxin, they start feeling the discomfort, they start feeling the pain that they get with that, and there is pain involved if you kill an animal with aldicarb. There's a suffering because they can't breathe. They emit the alarm signals and alarm pheromones, and everyone around them that's a rodent knows that that food that we ate now, don't eat it because it is potentially harmful, and the animals develop what we call a bait shyness very rapidly to that particular unlawful rodenticide, which is aldicarb. Compared to a coumarol or an indane-dione, the animals don't associate any of the symptoms they have with the food that they eat that contains the anticoagulant. And that's why they're so effective. They really work like a bomb. And the only thing I ever used in my life at home is maybe a mosquito spray sometimes, and then I use rodenticide once in a blue moon and a bit of glyphosate in between my succulents. But if you have a real rodent infestation and you use one of the coumarols or an indane-dione, if you see the way they operate, they keep on eating and eating and eating until they kill off and die and they go to rat heaven. That's why they're so effective, because there's no association between the symptoms and the food they eat. The only problem that we sometimes find in South Africa, and I picked it up with some people, they tell me, but your rats don't eat your stuff anymore because my name is on all the boxes as an emergency number, so people think I own the compound. They say, but the rats don't eat the wax blocks anymore, or they don't eat the grain weight anymore. That is bait shyness. It is not a resistance against the active ingredient. And that's why we always tell people, don't always use the same formulation. You split between a bait block and then a paste bait and then a granular bait and then your grain baits. So you've got to split between them to prevent animals from becoming shy towards the bait. But there's no reason in South Africa to believe that there's any resistance to any one of the rodenticides we have in the market. I hope you understand the process here. It's a very complex biological and biochemical process, but basically the coumarols and the indane-diones causes blood thinning or causes anticoagulation, and they start bleeding internally and they die from that. Look at the other ones, the cholecalciferol, which is natural vitamin D, which is essential for any animal. Listen to this. This is where the toxicology becomes very interesting. And this is where I've got a real bee in my bonnet about the whole CMR story and all these HH pesticides and blah, blah, blah. It's all about the dosage, not about the substance. And here we've got a perfect example where your body requires vitamin D3 every single day. Your body synthesizes its own vitamin D3 every single day if you expose yourself to sunlight. If you're a cave dweller, like some people are that never get out of their house, never get sunlight, you need to take a vitamin supplement because a normal human being requires up to 20 micrograms of vitamin D3 per day to keep the body healthy. Okay, I know, for example, that D3 also affects your visual ability. And that's why when you go into the Middle East, where I lived for a long time, and you interact with some of the Bedouins, and I had a lot of interaction with them. I rode the camels, which was fantastic. I stayed in their tents, which was even more fantastic, and the food was the best in the world. They have a problem with night vision because of the fact they wear the heavy clothes to protect themselves from that massive solar radiation in the desert, the Negev desert or the Arabian desert where they live, and their bodies don't synthesize enough vitamin D3 to give the proper night vision. So technically, the Bedou people, or like we call them, the Bedouin, need to take a supplement to supplement their intake or their synthesis of vitamin D3 in the body. But if you overdose an animal with vitamin D3, that overdose starts taking the calcium and the phosphorus from your bones. Remember, our bones consist of calcium phosphate. So it starts taking the calcium and the phosphate out of the bone. It puts it into the blood vessels where it coagulates and starts clotting up the blood vessels. It deposits into the organs like your liver, spleen, heart, kidneys, lungs, wherever. And the animal then, or the target animal then becomes hypercalcified, or what we call suffers from hypercalcemia. So it blocks up the entire intestinal system from your own body, from your own bones. You don't even have to give the animal any calcium because we carry a lot of bones in our body, especially mammals and the birds. So if you give them a lot of the vitamin D, not in the case of the birds, I'll tell you more about it later, but in the case of the mammals, you cause hypercalcification very, very easily. Now think about that. We as a human being, let's say a normal human being, I weigh 81 kilograms. I need about 20 micrograms of vitamin D per day, so I get in the sun very often, and I get enough of that. If you're a mouse, you probably require 0.1 of a microgram to maybe a microgram per day. But now in the rodenticide we offer the mouse, there's about 375 milligrams per kilogram there. So if they eat a proper meal of a particular bait, they ingest a massive, massive overdose, which immediately starts liberating or catalyzes the liberation of the calcium and the phosphorus, and the animal starts producing a lot of calcium and phosphorus in the blood vessels, and within a day they start getting the systems falling down. But as we find with the anticoagulants, this poisoning that we commit here with vitamin D is not acute. In other words, the animal doesn't eat the vitamin D3 now, and it kills over and dies within half an hour and 4 hours. It's a subacute and a long-term chronic system, which it poisons the animal and then affects the animal and kills the animal off. So I'll talk about this a little bit more a little bit later on. One thing which is very important in terms of rodent management, which is a very strong attribute of cholecalciferol, especially when you talk about the potential for rodents to cause structural damage or damage to your car wiring, is if they eat the cholecalciferol. Let's say they eat the cholecalciferol on a Monday evening, 8 o'clock, and you put it up in your ceiling in a bait box. By the Tuesday night, 8 o'clock, that animal loses all its appetite, which is a good attribute because of the fact that these animals gnaw. And you want them to stop gnawing, because if they get into your car and they destroy your wiring there, or they get into the ceiling, destroy the wiring there, or chew up the wood, you have a problem. So that is where vitamin D3 comes in, to help you to stop the feeding, because they don't eat after the first day, after they've eaten a good dose of vitamin D3. And the baits that we have on the market for the vitamin D3 are extremely palatable. I've seen animals going in, a big rat, I'm talking about these mothers that weigh about half a kilogram. They eat a 20-gram block in one sitting, in one go. That's a clock. Everything gone in one shot. So that's enough to put that animal into a phase of total loss of appetite within a day and dying off 4 days after the first injection. So there is a place in the market for vitamin D3 if you manage it properly. The phosphites are different. So you remember I spoke about aluminium phosphide, which is well known to most people, and then the zinc phosphide, which is mostly used in the bait form. So both of these chemicals are solids, but when they come into contact with any moisture or water, they produce phosphine gas. The phosphine gas is actually a killing agent in these two substances. So the aluminium phosphide reacts very rapidly. If you put aluminium phosphide into a bowl of water, it can auto-ignite, because that pH 3 gas can also auto-ignite at a temperature of minus 16 degrees Celsius. So it's a damn dangerous thing to put phosphine anywhere close to water, because of the potential for self-ignition and explosion. Whereas the zinc phosphide reacts much slower with water. So it is compatible with an outdoor environment, especially if you have a field full of gerbils and you want to apply a gerbil bait there. The zinc phosphide will not fuse as quickly as the aluminium phosphide and produce all the phosphine gas. But whichever way you use it, the phosphine gas is the one which goes into the animal's lungs or goes into the animal's intestines if they eat the zinc phosphide bait. It liberates the pH3 gas and it kills very rapidly. I've seen where we've applied zinc phosphide baits or even the aluminum phosphide tablets to rodent burrows, especially I'm talking about the gerbils here, that within 5 minutes, that animal is gone. It is dead. It is very, very rapid. So unfortunately, we know exactly what the mode of action is for the anticoagulants. We also know exactly what cholecalciferol does. But in the case of the phosphine, no one knows how it works in the whole biochemical system of the body. All we know, it's a very powerful neurotoxin that kills very rapidly, and it is acutely very, very toxic. So we've had many cases of human mortality until 2023 when I took control of it. We worked with all our registration laws and we closed the supply chain. We took it out of the hands of the public, and I'm very happy to say that this year I haven't had a single case of aluminium phosphide poisoning. It shows you what can be done if we take stewardship of a product to heart. But in the case of rodents, it fulfills a very important niche. And for the farmers, the zinc phosphide is a very powerful tool to control gerbils in an environmentally compatible way. And I'll explain to you why I say these things. And some of you on the call today, or some of the people that are anti-pesticide, might not like what I say here when we talk about these highly hazardous chemicals. But to me, there's no problem in using a highly hazardous chemical as long as you mitigate the potential risk that might arise from this. And it is easy if you use a bit of your common sense. And I think most people have common sense, but most people don't use it. So let us go then on to the toxicity, because that is what most people find very intriguing. And I've listed them all for you, starting off with the warfarin group or the comatet group, then followed by the indane diones, and then cholecalciferol, and then the 2 phosphides. So just look at that. Forget about the rest of the table. Look at that column which says acute rat oral LD50. And in toxicology, I think you might remember from my webinar I did, I think it must have been last year or early on this year, but I did a basic toxicology webinar for all of you. When you talk about toxicology, there are a couple of important things in that equation. First of all, it is the substance. Secondly, it is the dose. Thirdly, it is the path of exposure. And then fourthly, it is the organism. And fifthly, it is the gender of the organism and also the age of the organism. Those are 6 important factors. Now, we can go and draw acute oral LD50s for all of these compounds from all the peer-reviewed literature all over the world. And believe me, for me to have compiled this webinar for you took me the better part of about 19 to 20 hours, because I had to go and draw literature from the FDA and the FAO and from ECHO all over the place to get some sanity into my head about what is really the golden highway in terms of the acute rat oral LD50. So for the sake of the webinar, I only look at rat oral LD50. I will talk a little bit about the mice later on, because there's a problem with mice. And I also included the avian stuff, because we want to talk about what do these things do to our birds of prey, like the owls that do eat rodents. If we took just random stuff, we said, okay, some cases we take rats, sometimes we take dogs, sometimes we take guinea pig, or sometimes we take mice, the data would have been nonsensical, because you got to compare apples to apples. In other words, you work with a rat, and you take that as the oral LD50 for a male rat, because there's even a difference between the male and the female rats when you talk about toxicity of all these compounds. If we just look at that first table out there, and I think some of you know that the lower the value of the LD50 expressed in milligram per kilogram, the higher the toxicity. All of these compounds are acutely very toxic. If you go down, you see cholecalciferol. It has an LD50 of 40, sorry, let's go back one. It has an LD50 of 41 milligram per kilogram. So that's about the least toxic, if I put that in very big double inverted commas, of all the rodenticide. The rest of them are hellishly toxic. That's why they work so good for the rats and the mice. And if you look at the old warfarin, if you look at cometetrol, these two molecules are very close to each other. But the fact that you modified warfarin to synthesize cometetrol gives cometetrol a much lower toxicity compared to warfarin. If you go to the super warfarins, like brodifacoum and diphenhydramine, look at that. That is scary toxic. And if you compare then bromadiolone also, and bromadiolone is a very potent rodenticide, but it has a couple of attributes that make me like the molecule. Okay, so this is acute. In other words, if the animal eats one dose of the stuff, this is the dose required to kill the animal. But remember what I said, in most cases, except for the aluminium phosphide and the zinc phosphide, and I'm talking about the coumarol group, the indane-dione group, and the cholecalciferol, the animals do not associate any discomfort or any pain or any effects with the bait. So they keep on eating, they keep on eating, they keep on eating. And that's why we've got to draw up a column also with a chronic rat LD50. In other words, if that rat comes along, it is today, tomorrow, Sunday, and Monday. Now look what happens there. Can you see that the acute oral LD50 of the rodenticide, in most cases, is negligible compared to the chronic rat LD50? Why would that be? It's because the effect is cumulative. So you can feed an animal one dose of cometetrol. There's a very good chance the animal will escape with its life. And I've seen it how many times in my life, where a dog eats a whole box of cometetrol wax blocks. Nothing happened to it. But if that animal eats a block today, and the block tomorrow, and the block on Sunday, and the block on Monday, the animal has a serious problem because the effects are cumulative. And this is where rodenticide have the real power. Remember what I said, there's no shyness towards the active. There might be a bit of bait shyness. And there's no association with eating the food and anything that develops in the animal. So they keep on eating. And I want to point out to all of you marketing people out there today, I don't want to hear the story from you that, yeah, but our rodenticide, an animal only has to eat it once. Rubbish. They keep on eating it, even though a single dose will kill them. They keep on eating it until they croak, because there's no association between the symptoms and the bait they eat. And this is very often where people do what I call disingenuous marketing. So it doesn't matter what you sell in the market. The rodenticide might be a single killer or a single dose killer, but the animals keep on eating it. And the story that people tell you, yeah, but it's cheaper to use my rodenticide because it's a single feed rodenticide, doesn't hold any water because the animals eat until they croak. But the advantage is the more they eat, the less chance they got to survive. Look at diphenhydramine. And today, for the purpose of our discussion today, sorry, I want to go back. I am not going to mention any trade names here. I'm just going to mention the active ingredients. So look at the diphenhydramine. That acute oral LD50 for mice, that is hectically toxic. Compared to, for example, you all know LD-carb, you know what toxic LD-carb is. LD-carb's LD50 is 0.97 milligram per kilogram. Now, by all measures, that is very toxic. So 0.56 is about 44% of the toxicity, 44%, let me see. It's about 44% more toxic than LD-carb for a single ingestion. But if that animal eats a little bit per day, look at that. It is slightly over 0.004 milligram per kilogram. So that rat that comes along and nibbles on a wax block on a Friday, a Saturday, and a Sunday is going to end up in rat heaven and become a bat. In other words, a rat angel. It has no chance of survival whatsoever. And this is why I tell people, whenever you use a rodenticide, don't just think about a single case of your dog or your child accidentally ingesting it. Think about the case that you leave the stuff out, which I can tell you most people do. They don't take care of their stuff. They leave it outside, and the dogs eat a bit today, they eat a bit tomorrow, And Monday I get a call, my dog is lying down. The mucous membranes are very pale. What do I do now? Well, unfortunately, you've got to make the decision. Do you have 70,000 rand for the treatment, or would you rather like to take the dog to be euthanized by the vet for about 1,500 bucks and get yourself a new dog because you apply the stuff incorrectly, because the chronic toxicity of rodenticide is hectic compared to a single ingestion LD50. So take that into account when you talk to your clients when you apply rodenticide. If you look at, for example, the avian toxicity, this is now where the debate becomes very interesting. And there are a couple of people in South Africa that tell people don't believe what Verdoorn says, that there are rodenticides that are compatible with else. He talks rubbish. There's the science. Decide for yourself. Do I talk rubbish? Warfarin, the LD50, the oral acute avian LD50 is negligible. It's over 2,000. The dietary, in other words, if you dose the food with warfarin and you feed that to a chicken or a dove or an owl or a Canada goose, is technically zero because over 2,000, you don't think about toxicity anymore. Finish and clear. Look at the cometetrolol. In other words, if an owl eats a rat and in that rat is still active cometetrolol, which is slightly likely, and I'll tell you later on why I say slightly likely, that is not toxic to an owl. It's impossible. And I've never in my life had an owl perish from eating rats that were killed by cometetrolol. But there is a chance of poisoning if they eat it successively over a couple of days and they keep on eating rats because the dietary one is less than the acute one where they ingested meat. However, if you look at the super warfarins, look at that brodifacoum, look at diphenhydramine, those are terrible figures. Terrible in terms of it will kill the bird. If you look at diphenhydramine, it is not that bad, but still a big risk. If you look at fluclomiphene, looks a bit better. Look at bromadiolone, it looks much better. Look at difecinone, not to worry. Look at torfecinone, a little bit of a worry. Cholecalciferol, what did I tell you? If an animal eats that, the animal is going to perish. If a bird eats that, nothing is going to happen to it. There is virtually no chance of a poisoning if a bird eats that cholecalciferol because it doesn't affect their biosystems. And then lastly at the bottom, look at the phosphite. The phosphites remain very toxic. Okay, so, and why I say they're not applicable in terms of avian LC50, because if you apply those types of substances into animal feed, they're going to fuse, they're going to liberate the phosphine gas, and there won't be any toxin left anymore. All that will remain is aluminium oxide and then zinc oxide, both of which are non-toxic. So I hope you get the understanding there that all the rodenticides are toxic to mammals. Whether it's a single injection or a multiple injection, some of them are compatible with else. You're not allowed to call anything safe for else. You're not allowed to call anything safe for pets. And I go to certain stores on the weekend where I go and do my community service, and I listen to what the vendors tell the public out there. And when I hear the story, oh, this is pet friendly, I take them to the back part of the store and I preach to them until they tear up and they walk out of the store and they never come back. Okay, so we don't say that any rodenticide is owl friendly. Some of them are compatible with owls because the risk of secondary poisoning is very limited. There's always a risk, but the risk is limited. And that's what you need to do with your particular product. And some of you don't have these ones that are compatible with owls. But again, it depends on how do we apply it. We can still use something which is very toxic like diphenhydramine in a situation with birds if you do it the right way, that you don't have too much of a bycatch. A bycatch means that you kill something else which is not your target. Right. So this is basically to give you in a nutshell. Always remember, acute and chronic toxicity for mammals is hectic. Some rodenticides virtually non-toxic as acute toxins for birds. There might be a slight problem in terms of the dietary toxicity, but you won't get a case where you feed an owl, for example, maize meal and stuff, but the owl might feed on rodents over a period of time if you don't have a proper baiting schedule and a proper baiting program. But there are some of them that are still very toxic for the birds, like Rodenticide and like thiolone will be quite toxic for the birds. Okay, let me move on to the next one. We have to take something into account, that the rat and the mouse are two totally different species. The one is Rattus rattus, or Rattus norvegicus for the brown rat, and the first one was the black rat, and then Mus musculus. And if you don't know much about rodent biology, let me tell you something about them. Rats are gluttonous animals. So they will forage around. If they find a good source of food, they will go back and they will gorge themselves completely. And that's why it is very simple to kill rats, whether they're black rats or the very common or overabundant brown rat. It's easy to kill them because if you put down a bait box, and you will hear me talking about the bait box every few seconds today, because we are not allowed to apply rodenticide without a bait station or a bait box. Okay, so if you put your rodenticide into a bait box and Mr. and Mrs. Rat come around to the restaurant, they see over there some nice food, they will gorge themselves completely. And that's why many companies tell you, but with a single injection, the rats will die. That's correct, because they come and they gorge themselves correctly. They take in enough of any one of these compounds to kill them off completely. But because of the fact that they're not acute toxins, they're subacute and chronic, they will come back the next night because they know there is the place where we find that lack of food. It's like my favorite shawarma shop I go to in Tel Aviv. I always go there because I know it's the best shawarma. So the rats do the same. They see, oh, there's lack of food. We go back and we eat ourselves stuck in one shot on that food. And they eat enough to kill themselves off. Mice are different. A mouse is, what is the word I was looking at last night? They do bar hopping. So they go to a restaurant, they eat a bit. Then they said, okay, no, boys, let's go somewhere else. Let's see what they got in the next door shop. They eat a bit there, they eat a bit there, they eat a bit there. So a mouse seldom, if ever, takes in enough of the toxin in one meal to kill it off. And that's why to control mice with rodenticides is much more of a challenge than to kill the rats. And ask me, I've done the tests for many companies, I've done the trials, I've seen what happens with them. And with some of the active ingredients, I can tell you up to 22 days to kill a mouse population. Whereas if I do a proper baiting for a big infestation of rats, which I've done in many places in my life, I can tell you I crashed the population in 7 days with a proper baiting program. If it's the Rattus norvegicus, otherwise the brown rats, 100%. But another important factor to consider is what is the toxicity of my active ingredient compared to the rat and then, or between the rat and the mouse. Look at warfarin. You can see warfarin got an LD50 of 5.62 for the rats. It is nearly 10 times higher in terms of the LD50 in terms of the mouse. And remember, a higher LD50 means a lower toxicity. It means the mouse must take in much more per body mass or per kilogram body mass than the rat to take effect. Look at cometetrol. And I'm not going to say much about this because most people know it is my favorite because of the fact it's so compatible with owls. It is super effective against the rats. But boy, oh boy, if you have neat cometetrol to kill a mouse, eventually you've got to catch him and squash him with your shoe, because it is near impossible to kill mice effectively with a proper baiting program only using cometetrol. But then look at the master of rodenticides, Rodenticide. Rodenticide has an identical LD50 for rats and mice. That's why the specialists will tell you that know about rodent control If you want to go and you want to club the mice one shot, you go for Brodifaco. It works like a bomb. We can say very much the same for diphenhydramine. So diphenhydramine is very toxic to rats. It is also very toxic to mice. And the same goes for flucomorphin. Look at that figure for the rats. It's 0.13 to 0.5 compared to 0.8 for a mouse. So a poor mouse ain't going to make it. He might eat himself to pieces on cometetrol baits, but if he eats properly on the flucomorphin, he's not going to make it. And with bromadiolone also. So bromadiolone, I found in my own house, if I really want to club the mice, I buy myself bromadiolone. And they eat the stuff. I put the bowls out all over the place that I know there are 7 feeding spots for them. And within 5 or 6 days, I take care of them. So with the bromadiolone, to me, works like a bomb for the mice. If you look at difascinone, that now becomes a bit of a pain because the mouse is not as susceptible to the difascinone as the rats. But interesting then, the sister compound, chlorofascinone, is more toxic to a mouse than to a rat. This is the inverse of what we've seen for all the other things out there. So that's very interesting. I didn't even know it until I made it the comparative, or drew up the comparative table last night. And cholecalciferol, it is technically about the same. So even though we say that the chemicals are in most cases positively less toxic to a mouse, they can still effectively kill a mouse in a single feed. So warfarin can do it, unless you're in UK, where in the UK they use it so much that the mice have become virtually completely resistant to warfarin. And in many places in Europe, they don't use warfarin at all anymore. But please, don't try your luck with a mouse with cometetrol. You're not going to win the battle. I'll talk a bit more about something else before I leave the slide to give you some guidance on cometetrol with mice, but it's not going to work very well for you if you want to kill the mice. With the brodifacoum, diphenhydramine, flucomorphin, the bromadiolone, and also with the chlorofascinone, they are very effective to kill mice with a single feed, even though the mouse might be a bar hopper. If he goes to that food and he eats one single proper meal, it is going to wipe him out. The difascinone, nothing really. And then at the bottom, I put in there, even though the LD50 for the mice is lower than for the rats, or the LD50 is higher, over toxicity is lower, I say it is super effective for killing mice in a single feed. Why? Because the moment they ingest it, or the moment they come into contact with the aluminum phosphide, the gas that comes off, the phosphine gas, which is the real toxin, is a super fast, effective killer. And I told you that I've seen with my own eyes that it kills gerbils off in 5 to maybe 6 or 7 minutes. So it is very, very important. Take note of that. So what happened now with a company who is still the owner of cometetrol? They got a combination of cometet and cholecalciferol. And that we've done some studies, and I helped them with a study that they did in a warehouse and also in the field, is very effective against the mice. So why would that be? Because the cholecalciferol seems to be having, I wouldn't call it a synergistic effect, but it seems to have a complementary effect to the cometetrol. And it seems to work pretty well if you've got a combination of cometetrol and cholecalciferol. Whereas cholecalciferol on its own is very effective to kill mice. It definitely works like a bomb. And I asked the question down there at the bottom. What is the efficacy then for multiple ingestion? I think you see the answer in the third column when we talk about the acute oral mouse LD50. In some cases, with the mice, nope. In some cases with the mice, with the cometet, you're going to battle to kill a mouse. Difascinone, you stand a chance. But with most of the others, with the mice, with the multiple ingestion, it will still be effective to kill them off within about 7 days. In some cases, it takes up to 12 days, but not as rapidly as with rats. Rats, believe me, you can also ask Lee Ashford that knows, I think, more than rodenticides and how to use them than me. Rats are easy. Mice are challenging because of the fact that they're not single feeders. They go all over the place and they eat their meals in different restaurants in one single night. If the rats find a place, they gorge themselves and they get enough and there they go. Now we have to get on to the more difficult questions. And that is what happens with the chemicals once they enter the animal's biosystem or into the animal's body. And we've got to take a couple of parameters into consideration. First of all, metabolism. So let me be very clear, what is the difference between metabolism and chemical degradation? We're not talking about chemical degradation here. We're talking about metabolism. In other words, it is a toxin in a biosystem, in a biological organism, with enzymatic activity that might attack the molecule and might transform the molecule or break the molecule down. If I use the word transform, it means it might oxidize the molecule. And in many cases where you oxidize the molecule might only pick up an hydroxyl group in the molecule, but it detoxifies the molecule completely. So we're not talking about a physical degradation here. We're talking about a metabolism. So the enzyme attacks the molecule and it might transform the molecule or it might not do anything to the molecule. And look at the first column there. So the warfarin is very rapidly metabolized in the body of the animal. I want to move on to and link on the excretion also. The excretion means that what happens to the active ingredient in the animal? Is it sitting in the guts? Is it going to sit on the liver? Is it going to be excreted in the feces? Is it going to be excreted in the urine? Some substances are excreted very rapidly. So look at the metabolism there of warfarin. It is rapidly metabolized. So it is oxidized by the biosystem, and excretion is basically 80% at 7 days after ingestion. So if that mouse or rat ingested a sublethal dose, in other words, not enough to kill it, 8 days later, 80% of that compound is excreted in the urine and the feces. And I didn't make separate columns for the urine and the feces because then it becomes too complicated. In many cases, you will see they say that most of the rodenticide is excreted by the feces and very little actually by the urine. But I combined the two to give you an idea of what happens with all of them. And then on top of that, we attach then what happens to the little bit of the active that stays back in the body. It goes to the liver. And remember, the liver is the organ in the body that detoxifies most of the toxins. And the longer it stays in the liver, the longer the problem becomes for the environment, because if carnivores or avian predators pick it up, then they can start picking up enough of the substances over a period of time to start becoming toxic to themselves. So if we look at a couple of examples, I want to show you what happens with cometetrol. It is rapidly oxidized and it becomes 13-hydroxycoumarin in the body, or 13-hydroxycometetrol in the body, which is not toxic compared to cometetrol. The excretion is up to 50% 7 days after ingestion. And the half-life in the liver is relatively short. In other words, it's about 2 months where it stays in the liver. And mostly on that peritoneum, in other words, that little layer which sits on the outside of the liver. So that is why cometetrol is fairly compatible with ELS, or very compatible with ELS. So most of it is oxidized, and what is not oxidized is excreted, and the little bit that remains behind sits on the liver, where it is further oxidized into the non-toxic compound. But if we work with something like, for example, diphenhydramine, there is technically no metabolism. There's only a small part of it excreted after 3 days. And the half-life in the liver is 230 days. That's the better part of 3/4 of a year. Rodenticide, metabolism is there, but it is very, very slow. Only 23% excreted by 7 days. And the half-life is technically 1 year minus 2 weeks. It stays there for a long time. And so we can go on. So diphenhydramine, look at diphenhydramine. It is extensively metabolized within 7 days. And what is not metabolized is excreted at the rate of 96% at 7 days. And the little bit remains behind is 230 days. What does that tell you? It tells you that in terms of compatibility with secondary feeders, this might be compatible because most of it is excreted by the animal if the animal doesn't die. That's a good attribute of that particular animal. Compared to fluclomiphene, very much like diphenhydramine, no metabolism, very little excretion, and half-life 350 days in the liver. That's the problem there. Let us look at bromadiolone. There's extensive metabolism. 90% or about 90% is gone within 4 days through the feces mainly, and the half-life in the liver is 170 days. So it is much longer, for example, than the warfarin and the comatet. It sits there and it can actually build up in the system if animals eat it. Diphenhydramine, look here. There's very little metabolism. Same with chlorphascinine. Most of it is gone within 8 days or within 4 days, and the half-life in the liver is pretty short. So these two, unfortunately, we don't have in the country anymore, but they would have been two that I would say, right, if we have to go and do rodent control in the environment with owls, those would be some of my choice products compared to, for example, also comatetrol. Look at cholecalciferol. Cholecalciferol is technically no metabolism. There's no excretion. Half-life in the liver, the bit of it that goes to the liver is 15 days. So if your dog eats a cholecalciferol rat, your dog has a big problem. Believe me, I get those calls, and I get them on a weekly basis. Dogs ate a couple of rats that ate cholecalciferol. They get into serious trouble, very serious trouble. The phosphides are different. There's no excretion because remember, the phosphides automatically oxidize or they automatically fuse, produce the phosphine gas, and the phosphine gas kills them off. So there's nothing going to the liver. First degree poisoning, if any animal eats it, is extremely high. Secondary poisoning is highly, highly unlikely. And that is because the phosphine gas that comes off from the aluminum phosphide or the zinc phosphide is auto-oxidized in air to become phosphinic acid. And I think all of you know by now that phosphinic acid is both a fungicide and an adjuvant used in agriculture with virtually no toxicity. So this is just to give you an idea of the risk that will be posed then by rodenticide used in mammalian predators. We also have a slide here to show you what happens with the birds. Okay, now remember what I said. We look at the excretion rate. We look at the half-life in the liver. And then we look at the AV and LD50. And we look at the rate of secondary poisoning. And there are some of these compounds that definitely cause secondary poisoning. And I've had it in many cases. Diphenhydramine, definitely. Rodenticide, to a lesser extent. Never had comatet secondary poisoning. Warfarin is so old, I've never seen it in my life with secondary poisoning. So the only two that really flag up to me as compounds that will cause secondary poisoning of owls if you use it in the wrong way. Listen to me, I'm saying in the wrong way. Will be rodenticide and diphenhydramine. Doesn't mean we don't use them. Nope. It means if we use them in a place where we have owls present, or we have avian predators present that are diurnal raptors, then we've got to take extra precautions to make sure that we don't poison them. So you can use them in terms of being environmentally compatible, but then you've got to take extra note of that particular one. Whereas if we use something like cholecalciferol, or we use comatep, or we use the old warfarin, there's a very low likelihood of secondary poisoning. And I've also said to you then, what is the likelihood of getting secondary poisoning with the phosphites? Nothing, because the phosphine gas that kills the animal is so toxic, it kills rapidly, and then it oxidizes rapidly, become phosphinic acid. Whereas with the other ones, there is a little bit of a likelihood for difenicum or flucomorphan. Bromadiolone, yeah, there's a likelihood, but not really much. And then same with difecinone in the same class as we have with comatetrolol, unlikely to cause secondary poisoning. So this is what the people that go out and talk about conservation of owls and stuff don't know. And sorry to say, most of them talk absolutely rubbish because they don't know chemistry, they don't know biology, they don't know rodenticide toxicology, nothing like this. It all depends on your choice of rodenticide. It also depends on how do you apply rodenticide and what precautions you put into place. But unfortunately, most people don't think that way. They're not inclined to think about the long-term consequences of an action. And when I get the call about the owl sitting on the grass, now the owl looks very fluffy and doesn't look so good. What did you use? Oh, I used that particular substance. I said, yes, but now you kill the owl because you did not do your baiting in the right way. So you've got to be careful. I'm not slating any rodenticide yet today. All I'm telling you is that you've got to be very careful with some, but others you can be confident that your chance of poisoning an owl is not going to be that good. Give me a second, please. So given all those technical details that I'm sure you don't want to put into your own hard disk, but you can go and look at the recording again if you want to get a bit of a refresher. All of these things have to be taken into account when we do a rodent baiting program, so that we can do effective rodent control without impacting, first of all, on our companion animals, because believe me, the poor dog take a beating. The number of dog calls I take, and some months be up to 140 calls in a month of dogs having been exposed to rodenticides, most with primary poisoning, in some cases with secondary poisoning. So the dogs, first of all, need to be safeguarded against rodenticides. And then secondly, where my part comes in is to look after the owls. What can we do? We can look at what type of bait we apply, right? Especially with the dogs, because I don't care what dog you've got, whether you've got one of these little street mops, which is called a, I think it's called a schnauzer or a yorkie or whatever they call it, up until a Great Dane, they all eat anything they can get into their mouths, finish and club. So what I found over years and years and years of working with rodenticides and seeing the effects on animals and tested them on different farms and stuff is, if you want to go the lowest potential for poisoning of a dog, primary poison, in other words, of a dog eating the bait, then you've got to do the following. But let me stop myself there. If we go for what the label says, and we use a bait station like you see on the right-hand side, how is it then possible that the dog can still get to a bait if we use a bait station according to label instructions? It is a fact that rodents go into a bait station, especially rats. They gnaw off some of the block, and if there's blocks falling off, they take it outside, and on the way back to their burrows or their place where they live, they drop a bit of that wax block or a bit of the granules. Some of the bigger dogs make a meal out of a bait box. So they open up the bait box completely, so they get to the baits. And then people call me up, my dog ate the bait, even though I used the bait station. So you got to always put your bait station in a place where no one can see it. If I talk about no one, I talk about the animal side and the human side, because I get an equal number of calls about children that get exposed to rodenticide, which is not really very nice because it is a massive risk to children out there. So what I can advise you on, if there's a risk that your dog's going to be able to uncover the rodenticide bait box and get some of the bait into their bodies, then your safest option, and I use safest option there in triple inverted commas because it's not safe, but your least risk option will be a wax block, followed by a wax pellet, followed by a paste bait, followed by a pelletized bait, followed by grain bait, followed by a dusting powder, and the most risky compound will be a liquid bait. If you have a liquid bait, and most people don't have liquid baits available because we want to restrict them then to professional pest control operators for industrial use. But if your dog discovers a liquid bait and you put it out into a 1 liter container, your dog gobbles up half of that. The dog has virtually no chance of survival. So why do I say that the wax block is much more compatible with a dog than, for example, a paste bait? Simple fact. Dogs are carnivores. They don't masticate. In other words, they don't chew up their food. So if a dog finds a wax block, they grab the wax block, they bite once or twice, and they swallow the wax blocks. And the wax blocks of all the brands in the country have a high integrity because they're supposed to be weatherproof. Okay? And they don't actually digest in the animal's stomach, or they don't dissolve or break up an animal's stomach, and they only release a little bit of the active ingredient. The only one that I've seen that causes massive poisoning, two that I've seen causes massive poisoning when dogs ingest the wax blocks, will be diphenhydramine and brodifacoum. So be careful with that. But with the others, the wax blocks are safer to use than, for example, the paste baits because they don't release the toxin as rapidly because the dogs don't chew the stuff up into smaller bits. The wax pellets are also not as bad as the other ones because if a dog finds it, they lap them up, they swallow them, they don't chew them up, and again, they don't actually release the toxin very fast because they don't get digested in the dog system. And in most cases where people phone me up when a dog ingested one of these compounds, luckily most of the calls I get is, we just saw the dog now eating the bait. What do? Advise them to induce vomiting. The animals vomit the stuff out. We give them water, we give them electrolytes, and I would say 98% of the dogs make it without any consequences. But if you only call me up 2 days after the dogs ate the wax block, you have a problem in your hand for that. The paste baits, I should have actually put, the paste baits, they can be a problem because if the animals swallow the whole baits whole, in other words, the whole packet or the sachet whole, sometimes it's 10 grams, sometimes it's a 20 gram paste bait. It depends on the active ingredient. They can cause serious primary poisoning if a dog ingests it, but they are definitely much more risky than a wax block. And maybe later on I can talk a little bit more about this. But just think about the grain baits. A grain bait is actually super duper for a mouse. It's bad news for a dog because your active is loosely bonded to the grain granule. And if a dog eats it, that loosely bonded active will become liberated. It will enter the bloodstream of the dog very rapidly and poison the dog. The same goes for a dusting powder. But the dusting powder, I should not even have it in the list there because what is the chance of a dog getting hold of dusting powder? Let me tell you what happens. I just want to put this call off. Okay. Let me tell you what happens. If you take the dusting powder and you put it into the butters of the animals, a dog can't get to that. A dog might be able to lick up a few milligrams of the dust, no problem. So the rats go in there, they get it into their coats, and when they groom themselves, they take in the active ingredient. It's a very effective and a very neat way of controlling rodents. It's also very target selective and target specific. But what I had a month ago is that somebody bought the, the box of dusting powder. They left it on the table on the veranda, and the dog ate 1/4 of the box. That dog nearly didn't make it. If it wasn't for the good vet that I work with, that dog would have been completely gone. So what happened there was total misuse and total off label, because it tells you on the label, keep out of reach of children and pets. What did we do? We put it on the table where the Great Dane was, and that massive dog gobbled up the half the bloody box. It nearly croaked. So this is why things happen. So this is just some guidance to you in terms of, if you have a worry about a dog getting to a bait, go for the wax blocks. And why do the wax blocks work? Because animals gnaw. They don't go and they eat because they're hungry. They have to gnaw. And the wax block gives a rat and a mouse the perfect type of structure to go and gnaw and sharpen the teeth and comb it down. Then this is the thing that we've been preaching, all of us, from Rod Bell down to our youngest staff member in CropLife. Always read the label. And what Bill Smith and myself did back in the old days when we still had the small pack working group, we made sure that every one of our members who have rodenticides in the market put on the labels only to be applied in the bait station. In the case of rodenticide used for gerbils, we also say it can also be applied in the rodent burrow. In the case of the dusting powder, it is also to be applied in the rodent burrow. But it may never be applied like most of the public do. Just take the wax block, break it up into 8 pieces, toss it under the kitchen sink, and I get the call. Now what now? My dogs ate the bait. It's because you didn't read the label, you didn't lock it up, and you applied it outside the bait station in the open. What's very important also is that dogs are intelligent. They're very intelligent. They got noses. They got 40,000 times better sense of smell than people. Believe me, that is scientifically verified. So they smell these funny things because the baits have attractants in them. They smell the bait box, they dig it out, or they break it open and they eat it. So even if you apply your bait in a bait station, hide it at a place where your dog can't get to it. It's okay if a bull mastiff eats a wax block or two. It is not going to be okay if your little pooch that you carry in your handbag is going to eat a wax block, because it is going to pass away and you're going to feel very bad. So hide it completely away from their vision and also out of the place where the dog can actually scratch it open, get hold of it. If you have to do it in a garden, I tell people, put your bait station down and pack big, large boulders over it that the dog cannot move. Otherwise, your dog's going to open it up. You're going to have a problem with it. Where I do find a big problem is, like I said earlier on, the rats in particular, when they go into a bait station, they gnaw and they take stuff back to their burrows. Mice are not as bad as that. They don't actually go and they harbor a lot of food in their dens. The rats do it, right? So they might spill a bit of the bait. Your job in the early morning, before you let your dog out of the house, go to the bait station, see if there's any blue or purple or pink bits and pieces left, pick it up and dispose of it. And that way you prevent your dog from getting to it and getting poisoned. I've mentioned how many times, lock it away. That's why we've got a cupboard there. Lock it away. All the cases of children being poisoned by rodenticides is because they're not being locked away. That you have to do, lock it away. The law says you must do it. In the new regulations from Act 36 from August 2023, it says all the labels at the top must say, read the label before use. Even our ATSWIS must say, read the label before use. So you have to read the label. The labels say, keep it locked out of the reach of children and pets. What you can also do, if you listen to me today, you would realize that I said to you that none of the rodenticides, apart from the phosphides, kill immediately. It takes at least 3 to 4 to sometimes 7, in the case of mice, up to 22 days to kill them off properly. In the case of the rats, you normally find on the 4th day after the first application, They come out in the early morning, they walk around dizzy, or they die on the spot out there. Your job is to go out with your gloves and a plastic bag to collect the dead and dying ones. If you find a live one, whack it over there, kill it, and put it into a plastic bag and dispose of them. That way you take the risk away that an owl or your dog might pick it up and get secondary poison. It's not that difficult. To add on another little hint there for people, there are some people who call me up and said, we heard. Now, the moment I hear we heard, I want to get the heebie-jeebies because that is always either Facebook rubbish or community rubbish that I heard. We heard that the rats die only where they eat the food. No, they die anywhere. Remember, they eat at a certain place. Then they go and they play and they visit and they got a beer party or they go back to their den to go and sleep. They die all over the place. And if you applied your bait in the ceiling, climb into the ceiling with your plastic bag and your gloves and go and check around there and pick up the carcass and dispose of them. Unfortunately, sometimes that mouse or the rat might die behind the kitchen cupboard that you can't remove, and you're going to have that pong for a few days. That is a fact. There's also another myth which I got to quench here, and that is that people say the rodenticides desiccate the rats. That's absolute rubbish. They do not desiccate the rats. They froth like anything else. In summertime, it's going to be more pungent than in wintertime because at least in wintertime, there's a slow decay. It's a drying out. In the summertime, with all the heat and stuff, there's a lot of bacterial action, and that carcass is going to be pungent for a couple of days. What I also want to go into, and I don't want to go into too much detail because that's a whole course on its own, is to do pulse baiting. Pulse baiting means you don't keep on putting rodenticide out every single day of the year, especially when you've got a risk of owls picking up dead rats. And I'll get to that a little bit later. Even with your dogs, you do a baiting period of, let's say, 12 days, and then you remove the bait for 14 days and you don't put out anything again. And you only start baiting again, you start seeing rodent activity. How do you know that? You keep your ears open, you keep your eyes open, you scout with your nose for that typical rat urine smell. It smells very, very distinctly. And you also check for the feces on the floor because they all poop all over the place, and you pick up those little pellets. And you can see from the small ones it's a mouse, or the big one it's a rat. So that's also something which I'll discuss more when we get to the last slide, which is about the owls. And I'll also want to tell you that everything I said here about the dogs, it's 100% applicable to children. And I would like to know that before I croak one day, we don't have any dogs and any children being poisoned by rodenticide because the parents or the homeowners do not follow the safety instruction. It is terrible when you get the call from somebody, my dog ate the stuff probably on Sunday, it is now Wednesday, it's starting to bleed, what do I do now? I have to be honest with them. There's nothing, even a vet at that time cannot save your dog from mortality because it is too late to induce the treatment for the dog. You have to get the dog to a vet as soon as possible. And what really blows my mind is that these people seem to be dog lovers. I don't love dogs. I like other animals. And yet, when the dog gets poisoned by themselves because of their incompetence in not reading the label, not following instructions, they don't want to spend the money to go to a vet and get the dog checked out and get the dog onto vitamin K1 injections or a drip or then vitamin K1 tablets. It does cost a fortune, unfortunately, but that's all you can do. Right, I think my second last slide is going to be, what about my favorite? What about the owls? Without taking into account the commercial needs of our members, I'm going to advise you that you look at my list and you take those actives with the lowest avian toxicity if you have an abundance of owls on the property. The property might be residential, it might be peri-urban, it might be a farm. And we are blessed in the country with a very large population of barn owls and also spotted eagle owls. The barn owls are the mouse hunters. They seldom, if ever, take rats. The eagle owls, they are the rat killers. And when I lived in Joburg, I did a survey on my own one day, and I found that in my neighborhood, which was there down below the Northcliffe area up to London, there was one pair of owls per 2.5 square kilometers. That was a quite a dense population of owls. But despite that, we still had a lot of rats, and we have to be very selective on how we control them. So if you're concerned about your owls in your garden or in a farm, and many people on the farms now use owls to help them to control the rodent with great effect. But there comes a point where the population just becomes too large for them to control it, and then you're going to bring in rodenticide to take care of the population. So selective and active ingredient with the lowest possible aiming toxicity. And what I would recommend you do is you go in hard and you do a 1-2 week baiting campaign. In other words, you put out your baits in the bait boxes for 14 days, you take it away completely. Why would I say that? It is to protect the owls. So if the owls then pick up a rodent, let's say, for example, I'm going to take one active. Let's say they pick up a rodent which was killed by Comatetrolol. A single or 2 or 3 mice per night, or 1 or 2 rats per night for a spot owl, might not be a problem. But if that owl eats dead rodents day after day after day for 2 or 3 months, that owl is going to develop a problem with chronic toxicity, because the chemical remaining behind the rats will build up in its own biosystem, build up in the liver. It might get to a toxic dose and then kill the owl. So you do one compounded campaign over 14 days and then stop it. And then you've got to make a concerted effort to recover the dead and dying rodents. And I tell people in that case, even on day number 3, I see sometimes on day number 3, when you use any of the anticoagulants, they come out in the morning of day number 3. They seem to be lekker in mekaar. You pick them up, you whack them over there, and you take them out of the eyes and the feet and the claws of the owls and your dogs. And that way you do the right thing. We might get to a point, especially on intensive farming situations, like you've got chicken farms or feedlots or pig farms, where there's a massive outbreak. And it happens sometimes that farms call me up and say, hey, man, all of a sudden we've got a massive a massive mouse population. Then you take what we call the blitzkrieg approach. And in that case, I would say take an active ingredient that you know with a single ingestion of the active will take the rodents out 100%. We call that also the big hammer approach. It does pose a risk to the owls, most definitely, because now we're talking about something like prodifical or bromadiolone or difethiolone. What do you do to safeguard your owls? If you have owl boxes and they're in the owl boxes, you can take the owl box and move it away from the point of application. Okay. One wonderful thing about the owls is, even if you move the house, they find the house. They go a hectare away to find the owl house there. Especially if they've got eggs and they've got little young ones in the nest. Both the spotties and the barn owls go and they find the nest because the young ones got that wheezing call. And the parents pick it up and they go back and they feed in there. I've done it myself many times on farms. We had to move a pair of owls with chicks, or we have abandoned chicks to put them into a nesting box. The parents take care of them. So you take a big hammer, you knock them, you take the owls away from that harmful zone, and you do a 7-day baiting period. 7 days is enough to take care in terms of rats or the mice if you take one of the more toxic rodenticides. And you have a mandate in terms of your conscious and responsibility to go out with a sweeping effort every single morning and every single afternoon to pick up any dead and dying rodents and dispose of them so that your owls can't get to them at night. Okay? It is required in many cases where you've got a hell of an infestation. And these things mostly happen with the mice. The rats seem to be omnipresent, or as we say, ubiquitous. They're always there. But the mice are here and there, and suddenly you get a massive explosion, and you got to come in then with your big hammer approach and take them out within 7 days. And I think it can be done. Then after that, if you had your short burst program and you controlled the rodents down to acceptable levels, bring your owls back, put their perches back, put their owl boxes back. But you must monitor the situation. And that's where most people fail with rodent control, because they think, okay, I put up my rodenticide, I've beaten the rodents, no problem, everything is hunky-dory. You'll be surprised to know that within 21 days, you might have another massive infestation. So you need to do tracking, you need to do monitoring. You can put up trial cameras, you can put up normal builder's chalk, the blue chalk on the floors or the runways of the rodents. And if you see the chalk is disturbed, you can look at that and see, oh, I see a rat spoor, or I see mice spoor, or I see the droppings, or I smell urine. And you go back and you control again. So it is not an easy task. You've got to have your wits around you. And I would recommend that you speak to somebody who's a specialist on this before you go and embark on a program if you have owls around, because the last thing you want to happen to owls in the country is to succumb to the pressures of rodenticides. All of them have a risk. Some of them have a low risk. Some of them have a massive risk. And I remember reading an article by the EPA where they on their own went out into a very big grain farming area in the USA. And they sampled owls all over 50, I think it was 54 farms. And they found, because of the long-term use of brodifacoum and bromadiolone, all the owls had sublethal doses of those two compounds in their livers. Why? Because of bad chemicals? No, because the farmers did not do pulse baiting programs. They put out rodenticides every single day. Now, if you do pulse baiting programs, you limit that buildup of the chemicals in the food chain, and you limit the exposure of the owls to those particular chemicals, and you safeguard your owls. So let us be a bit more clever than the Yankees. And I hope you followed today what I told you. We have a rodent problem. We have soft chemicals. We've got hard chemicals. We've got owls. We've got dogs. We can still do rodent control effectively without posing a risk to anybody if we do it in the right way. But you've got to sit down, work out what you're going to do. You have to have your battle plan ready, because without a battle plan, you're not going to be successful, and you're going to be causing harm to your dog, and you're going to be causing harm to your owls around you. And I do not want to see owls dying, because they are very important for the ecology, and they are enigmatic species. Many people call up and they want to buy an owl box. They want them in the garden, which is great. I think we're one of the very few countries in the world where there's a very loyal following amongst people of owls. And the company that makes these big water tanks, they also make a plastic owl box, and they sold thousands upon thousands of them. And all the people that advised to buy them phone me up and say it was amazing to see how the owls occupy those. So use the owls, but don't poison them. Use your brains, use your common sense. Get stuck, you give me an email or give me a call, I will help you. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, I'm done with my presentation. Yuresh, I don't know whether there are any questions. I'm going to stop sharing now and go back to the screen, and let's see if there are any questions from anybody.
Gerard.
Yep.
Gerard, firstly, thank you for an excellent and highly informative webinar yet again, Gerard. For me, what really stands out is the passion with which you present. I think it's truly remarkable to take such an interesting topic and break it down the way you have. It's been excellent. Yeah, Gerard, there are questions for you. Firstly, not so much a question, but more a comment added to the chat box by Tom Murray. He mentions that environmental health is even more of a concern now with the banning and impending of many of the anticoagulant rodenticides. Would you like to make a comment on that, Gerard?
Yeah, I would like to make a comment on that. If the government bans rodenticides, they must take responsibility for the bubonic plague outbreak we're going to have. That's all I'm going to say, nothing more. And thanks, Tom. I know Tom pretty well. We spoke a lot last year. I see a real disaster coming. If they take our tools away to control rodents, we're going to have a food safety issue. We're going to have a food security issue. We're going to have a real bubonic plague issue as well. It's going to happen. Mark my words.
Excellent, Gerard. Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more on that. Wonderful answer there. Moving on, Gerard, Billy Vessels also have put forward a question in the chat box. He wants to know, what would you recommend as a workable active ingredient for the control of dassies, rock hyrax?
There's no active ingredient for that, Billy. The only active ingredient that I know that can be legally used for dassies is lead in the form of a .22 rifle. Okay, so if there's a problem with dassies, you're not allowed to poison them. There is no registered agricultural remedy for that. If they do become a problem in urban areas, you can make contact with your municipality, you can make contact with the police, and you can get a special permit that they can allow you under their supervision to go and take the dassie population out. It is possible, but it takes a bit of effort, and it has been done in some places in KZN. So that's what I would recommend. But I will never, ever in my life advocate for the use of any agrochemical. Not at all.
Great, great, Gerard. I think what you said at the very start there really grabbed everyone's attention. But yeah, again, another excellent answer, Gerard. And then finally, I just see one other question from Liesel Davy. And the question pertains to how to control moles, Gerard.
Okay, for the moles, Liesel will be talking here about the rodent moles, because remember, we've got two groups of moles. We've got the typical rodent moles, of which I got one uninvited one in my garden, which caused massive bloody havoc. And then we've got the golden moles that are not rodents, but they're actually insectivores. So with the mold itself, we've got two choices. If it's a small infestation, there are two companies in our country. I think the one is a member of CropLife SA. They produce a 40% concentrated extract of garlic oil. And if you pour that, a teaspoonful of that into the mole burrow, it repels them out of your garden. I just have to warn you, like I spoke to a wonderful Indian lady a month or two ago. She opened the bottle, she did not wear gloves, and for a month after that, she had that garlic odor on her clothes and so on. So it does work. If it is a large-scale infestation, then you are allowed, in terms of the labels of some of the aluminium phosphides, to poison them in their burrows, but we are rapidly moving that over to pest control operator use only, because of the risk that I've seen with people buying aluminium phosphide for rodent control or for mole control and poison themselves. So yeah, there are one or two of the aluminium phosphide which can be used to control rodent moles, but it might very soon change. It will only be available for pest control operators. And what I do is the public phone me up and they ask me, what do we do? I advise them to basically use the garlic extract, not the aluminium phosphide, because my fear is that we go back to 2022, where we had 130 mortalities per year with aluminium phosphide. So to me, that is a special product that should be in the hands of a specialist, and that means a pest control operator with a proper license.
Great, great. Thank you, Gerard. Thank you for that again. Yeah, Gerard, I don't see any more questions. I think Lee Ashford has posted a nice comment in the chat box. He mentions plant garlic chives in your garden, and that tends to also work well on golf courses. But yeah, Gerard, other than that, no further questions. Before I close the webinar, I'd just like to quickly remind all of those participating in the CropLife SA CPD program that the assessment is available in category 1 of the CPD platform. And Gerard, I think you'd agree with me that anyone who listened tentatively should pass that assessment with flying colors. Yeah, Gerard, is there any final words from you before I close the webinar?
I think so, yeah. Many of the people today on the call are members of our association. There are guests here like Tom Murray. Doesn't matter where you come from. Always, always follow the label. And please, for my sake, dealing with all these calls I get on my poison center, lock the stuff away. Never ever go home and forget it on the table, because I can tell you the number of dark mortalities I deal with per year, nauseating. And when I deal with people that's 7 weeks in a row, I get the call every day, what can I do with my dog? What can I do for my dog? What can the vet do with the dog? So if we just lock the stuff away, if we use bait stations and we keep it out of reach of children and pets and away from their vision, then rodenticides, there's nothing wrong with them, nothing. They serve a very good purpose. For me, the purpose is to prevent bubonic outbreak in our country, because I can see it coming. Thanks.
Thank you, Gerard. Thank you for those final words as well. And again, I think from everyone online as well, thank you for another amazing webinar. It is truly appreciated. Gerard, all your time and hard work that goes into putting together these webinars. Gerard, I hope you do have an excellent weekend, and likewise to everyone who's joined online today.
Thanks.
Should there be any further queries or inquiries, Gerard has kindly puts up his contact details, so please feel free to contact him should any of you need any extra information. But with that said, it brings us to the end of the webinar session today. I'd like to wish everyone a wonderful weekend. Stay safe and have fun. Thank you to all. Cheers. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.